It is time to tackle Notion formulas. If you've ever found yourself looking at a formula property feeling confused as heck, we're fixing that today. Formulas are going to help you take your Notion workspace to the next level, and even if you use a Notion template, like mine for example, it's good to at least have a foundation in how Notion formulas work so you can make your own additions and customizations. Or maybe you want to create your own Notion workspace widget, like this one. I've had many requests for a tutorial on how to create your own custom widget, and you can consider this video part 1 because here's the secret. These widgets are made entirely of formulas. Notion formulas got a huge upgrade last year, aka Notion Formulas 2.0, where formulas became more powerful, and now they feel a lot more like coding in JavaScript. If you know nothing about coding, that's okay because we're gonna go over some of the basics. For the sake of simplicity today, there are 4 terms that I want you to know. The first is variables. Variables are like the containers that hold our information that we can then reference later. When coding, you normally have to create your own variables and then decide what information you want to store in them. But in Notion, it's a little bit different because technically our database properties are our variables. Now you can create variables that are not part of your normal database properties, and I'll touch on those a little bit later. Number 2 is data types. These are attributes of the data that tells the system how to interpret its value. You may have heard of some of the data types used in traditional coding, such as ints, arrays, booleans, and strings. But Notion has its own data types that you'll want to know. Some of them line up with the more traditional coding data types, and others are unique to Notion. Notion supports 7 data types. They are strings, numbers, booleans, or checkboxes, dates, people, pages, and lists. Now, don't worry, we'll talk about these more in just a minute. Our third term is functions. Functions take in our data, process it, and then return new data. Notion has a long list of functions specific to its formula editor, and I'll link that down below for you to browse through on your own. We're going to touch on a few specific functions today, but I'm not going to talk about all of them or else we would be here for hours.
3 hours later.
Our fourth term is operators. These are characters that represent a mathematical or logical operation. So think back to math class here. We have our mathematical operators like adding, subtracting, and multiplying, our logical operators like and or, and our comparison operators like greater than, less than, and equal to. All operators have functions inside the Notion formula editor in case you want to use those instead. But using the symbol version of these operators can help keep your Notion formulas clean and tidy. Plus, I just think they're more fun. So now let's dive a little bit deeper into the data types within Notion by looking at Notion's database properties and what data type each of them are. I've got a nifty little database to reference here in Notion, and I'll link this page for you down below so that you can keep it as a reference too. So let's go through this database together. The first type we have here is the text property. You probably know that one. It is used right here as our little notes property, and its Notion data type is text. Now, in traditional coding, you might know this data type as a string. When we use text within the formula editor, we're going to want to keep that text within quotes so that it knows that it is a text data type. Next, we have our number property, and that is, again, a number data type. In traditional coding, you might know this as an int or an integer. There are a couple different ways that you can classify this, but that's the most simple one at least. Next up, we have the checkbox property, and this is known as a Boolean data type. Now, Notion does refer to it sometimes as checkbox, but it is a Boolean. And traditionally in coding, this is also known as a Boolean too. Now, a Boolean, if you've never heard of that, is basically true or false. Think of it this way. If you have an equation that says 1 equals 1, that's true, right? But if you have an equation that's 1 equals 2, that is false. So that is what a Boolean is. It's just saying whether something is true or false. Next up, we have the select property, and that is going to be a text type property because when you reference it within the formula editor, it's going to read it as text. Again, this is also known as a string. Next up, we have the multi-select property, and this is just a little different. It is still a text property, but if you have multiple tags, like I do here in the data type, I have the tag text and list, then it's going to become a list because there are multiple things within that property. In traditional coding, this is known as an array. And all an array is a list of items. Now, these can be strings or numbers. It could be lots of different things, but the important part is that it is one specific object that has multiple different objects inside it. Just like your shopping list or your to-do list, you're gonna have multiple things on that list, and that is just what an array is. Arrays can feel kind of confusing at first, but the most important thing to remember, at least within Notion, is that you might have to use different functions on them than you would on, say, a text property. There are a few different Notion functions that let you search within a block of text for specific characters if you want, but you're not going to want to use those functions when you're trying to look for something within an array because you're going through multiple objects instead of characters. So that's just something to keep in mind. Next, we have our status property. Now, if you know the status property within Notion, you have two options when you set it up. You can set it up as a select property, or you can set it up as a checkbox property. So because of that, we have two different data types, the text data type or the Boolean, and you can pick whichever you choose. Next up, we have the date property. These are data types of date. And in traditional coding, it's also a date data type. There are quite a few functions that are only specifically working with dates because you might want to format them specific ways, or you might want to find the amount of time between two dates. There's lots of things that you can do with them. And we will be going over the format date function today because that is an important one to know. Next up, we have the person property. This is a very unique property to Notion. This doesn't exist in traditional coding. So the data type within Notion is a person. This is nice because you can reference a person's name or email just by using the person data type. Next is the relation property. Again, we see another data type that is very specific to Notion, and that is the page. This is because relations are used to connect two databases. So you can relate them to each other and then reference a page from one database in the other database. So what you're going to find inside the relation property is another page from a different database. Now, just like our multi-select property that we talked about up here, relations can also become a list if you have multiple pages linked. So again, that is just something to keep in mind when you're creating your formulas. Then lastly, we have our rollup property, and this guy is kind of like the wildcard property. Rollups can literally be any data type, and this is because it completely depends on what it is that you're rolling up. As a reminder, once you have related two databases together, a rollup property is going to take one property from one database and make it visible in the second database. And because of that, whatever property that you choose to roll up is going to be the data type of that rollup. Now, when it comes to using rollups in formulas, it's actually very interesting because when Notion did their Notion Formulas 2.0 update, it actually kind of removed the need for rollups because you can create rollups within the formulas. Now, there are certainly times when rollups are just easier because you don't need to make a whole formula out of it. But if you're using your formulas, you can actually filter those rollups to get specific data points that you need instead of just getting all of that information from one property and one database to the other one. We're going to take a more in-depth look at rollups when we do our part 2 to this video, so we will come back to that idea. But the important part here is that when you're using a rollup in a Notion formula, it's going to be presented as a list. So again, we just went through all of the data types of the properties within Notion, and the most important thing to remember here is that these data types are going to dictate which functions you use in the formula editor. Speaking of the formula editor, let's hop into it and take a peek. So I'm just going to create another formula property right here on this database for us to kind of play around with. When we click on the edit button right here, then we can see the formula editor. Here where our cursor is where you can type in all of your formulas. And then once you start to type them, there's going to be another little bar that shows up right here at the bottom that's going to give you a preview of what your output will be. It's also going to let you know if there's any errors in the code, so if something shows up that's red, something's not right. Now we have two things that we can find over here on the left side. First is our properties that are in the database that we're working in. It is kind of cool to note that you can always reference the created by, created time, last edited by, last edited time, even if those properties aren't ones that you have chosen to put in your Notion database, because Notion keeps all of that information in the back end. Then we're going to have all of our functions and operators. Here are a few operators that you might want to grab, and then here are some functions to get you started. There are quite a few of them. When you click on a function, it's going to add it to your editor, but the cool thing is that on the right-hand side, you're going to get a little preview of how that function actually works. So as we can see here with an if statement, when we build that out, there are 3 things that you're going to need. The first one is a Boolean, right? Our true or false. Usually this is going to be a statement that we write out that the formula editor can kind of look at and say, oh, hey, this is true or this is false. The next thing we're going to have is something that's going to display if it is true. Then thirdly, we'll have something that's going to display if it's false. In the little examples that it gives you here, you can see if it's true, it's going to display a 1 because that's what we want it to do if it's true. In this one, it's false and it's displaying 2 because that's what it's going to do if it's false. So let's go ahead and follow this example, and we're going to go ahead and use a property that we have inside our Notion database. I'm just going to go ahead and click on the Notion property right here, which is the name of the property that we were talking about. When I click that, it shows up in a little gray box here, and it's important that when you're referencing properties that exist in the database, they need to be showing as a gray square like this, and if it's not, then it's not probably referencing the property correctly. So for our Boolean statement, remember true or false, I'm going to go ahead and say if the Notion property equals text. Now remember, we need to keep it in our quotes if we want to use it as a string. If this is true, I want it to give me a checkbox that says it's true. So to do that, all I'm going to do is write out true. And then if it's false, I want it to be a blank checkbox. So all I'll do is say false. And there we go. We've done our first formula. So now if I hit done, we're going to go ahead and see what it does. And here we go. We can see our Notion property equals text, and it's showing true. Now we don't always have to do true and false here. We can do something else. I want it to actually read out true and false to me. I want it to be a text. So now I'm going to write out true in quotes and false in quotes. Okay, now let's see what it does. There we go. It says true and false for everything else because this is our property that is text. We can also do this with numbers, just like our little example showed us. So maybe I want it to be 1 if it's false and 0 if it's true. Then let's go ahead and say done. And now we have 0 and 1, because again, 0 is true and the rest are false. Something else to note real quick, if you have a formula that outputs a number, you can go ahead and format that number right here in the Edit Properties section. If we click on that, we see we can make it a number, percent, or a currency. If I make it a percent, we can also choose to show it as a bar or a ring. Now, this doesn't really make that much sense with what we were trying to do with our formula, so I'm just going to go ahead and edit it back to being true or false. Before we continue, I want to address something super important when it comes to coding, and that is formatting and commenting. When you look at my little formula that I have written out here, you might say, oh, that looks nice and clean, it's not too bad, it's one line, and that's because it's a really simple formula. But when we start to get into more complex formulas and we have multiple lines of code, you don't just want a paragraph of text because you're going to be so confused what you're looking at. So what I like to do is make multiple lines. In the Notion formula editor, to do that, all you have to do is press Shift and return, and that's going to create a brand new line for you. Now, I do recommend doing it after the commas because those are really important within the Notion editor, so I'm going to do it after the comma, and then again for the last line. So now we have multiple lines of code. Now, if we have a very simple formula like this, I don't necessarily always recommend that because now it looks funky, right? But if I have multiple if statements that I want it to look at, that's when it starts to matter. So let's say we want to use the ifs function. This allows you to use multiple Boolean statements and look at different things instead of just using one. The way this guy is going to work is now we're going to have a statement, whether it's true or false, then we're going to have what happens if it's true. We're going to have another statement, whether it's true or false, and then again, what happens if it's true. Then our last thing that we put is what happens if it's false. So as an example, we're going to go ahead and add 2 more Boolean statements to this formula. First, we're going to go ahead and say if Notion property equals checkbox. We'll go ahead and also say that's true. And then if our Notion property equals number, then we'll also say that's true. Now we have 3 different Boolean statements. It's going to look at our text property, checkbox property, and number property, and make those true and the rest false. So let's go ahead and look at that, hit done. Now you can see the first 3 are checked as true and the rest are false. Now let's look at commenting. The idea behind commenting is you want somebody who has no idea what you have done inside a formula to be able to come in, read your comments and say, oh, I know exactly what this person did. Plus, if you forgot what you did, then you can always come back and reference your comments. So for this example, I'm going to go ahead and put a comment at the top of each of our Boolean statements so I know why I'm doing that. To create a comment in Notion specifically, you're going to hit the / and the star, and then we can write our text without worrying about quotation marks or anything funky like that. So I'll say, see if Notion property contains text. Then to finish that comment, you're going to do the same thing but backwards. We're going to hit our star and our / And now you can see it's blued out here and it's not affecting our formula at all. Then I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste these above the other ones. And then on our false statement, I always just want to make a note that this is if it's false. So now that we have all that in there, you can see why it's important to use lines and formatting in your coding, because this is very clean and neat, and I can easily read what's going on. So we have looked at the if function. Let's go ahead and look at another function that I think is really important in Notion, and that is the let function. In this function, what we're essentially doing is creating a variable. Now, if we remember back to the beginning of this video, variables are where we're storing our data. In Notion, that's often our properties, but sometimes in formulas, we want to create a temporary variable that is only for that formula and nothing else. So let's say for this example, I want to create a variable that holds some text. I'm going to create a new line, and then we get to name our variable whatever we want. In this case, I'm just going to write text. Then I am going to write in the text that I want it to hold. I'm going to write the Notion property we are looking at is a blank. My keyboard is sticky if you see these double E's happening. Now, if we look down here where Notion explains how we're supposed to use this function, we can see we write our variable, we write what's in it, and then we're going to write how we're going to display that. So what I like to do when I use let statements is create another spot here with a comment that says display, just so I know what's going on. And then I'm going to write out what I want to display. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and start with our text variable that we see it actually added down here on the left-hand side. And then I'm going to add it to our Notion property variable. Then we're going to close our formula and take a look at what we've done. There we go. The Notion property we were looking at is a text. And it says that for all of our entries now. Now, just like we had the if and ifs function, let also has a lets function. And this allows us to create multiple variables. So maybe let's just go ahead and say I want to create another variable that goes on the end of what we just wrote that says property. So I'll go ahead and create a variable called property, and the text inside it I want it to say is property. Then we can come down here to our little display section and write out our new variable. And when we take a look, we can see it added property onto the end here. Now, here's your reminder that when you're adding text like this, you want to include those spaces. So we put our space back in and now we've got it formatted correctly. Now again, I would always comment what these little variables are and why you made them, but we are going to move on to our next function. This function is going to be the toNumber function. As you can see down here on the right hand side, it shows us exactly how we can use this function. And basically all this function does is take a string that is also a number and converts it to a number data type. So as I write inside the parentheses here toNumber, if I write in the string of 2, it's going to spit out a number data type. Now I had it set to % here, so let me put it back to number, and there you go. So now we have the option to use this number formatting. Maybe I want it to be $1. And this is really important when you go to start using those rollups and things like that, because they'll often come through as text properties and you might want them to be numbers. Now, I want to show you that there are also different ways that you can use certain formulas. For example, the toNumber does not have to be formatted in this specific way. We could take out the 2 and put it in the front and add a dot. And now it's going to do the same exact thing. This is just a choice in the way you choose to format your formulas. Not all of the formulas I would recommend using this way, but if I have a long string of things, like I'm filtering out a bunch of different data points, from a roll-up or something like that, I like to use the dots because I think it comes cleaner than if I were to have multiple different formulas where I would have tons of parentheses there. It just kind of looks like a mess. And using these dots allows it to kind of keep that section of the formula separate from everything else. So it's kind of a style choice. You do you. The last function I want to look at today is the format date function. I think that one is super important to know. So let's take a look at it. Our format date function is going to take a date property and turn it into a string. And what's cool about this is we can make that string display however we want it to. So for this example, I'm just going to use the now function, which is going to take the time that it is right now, and then we're going to format it. To format the date, we're going to write down a string of characters that's going to tell the formula editor how you want to display this date. I will link a resource for you down below that shows all of these different options so that you know what you want to pick. But for example, I'm just going to go ahead and do 4 lowercase d's, and that's going to give us the day. So as you can see, today is Thursday. We can also do a traditional date format. So month, day, year, and there we go, 4/11/24. So this is super fun if you have a specific way that you want that date to be shown. Don't forget that dates also have a time component. So if you want to show the time, you can do that as well. Now, obviously, there are many more functions within the Notion formula editor, but the few I just highlighted are ones that I find myself using quite often in my own formulas, and they're a great place to get started. I want to encourage you to try 2 things over the next week. Try using the functions I highlighted in your own formulas for practice. Then I want you to head to the list of Notion functions, pick one that I didn't highlight, and see if you can use it on your own. If you can find the functions you need and apply them using the basics we learned today, then you'll be able to use any function. You'll be golden. If you learned something new in this video, give it a thumbs up and leave any questions you have in the comments below. Then mark your calendars for April 26th when part 2 of this video will be up. We'll be applying all of this knowledge to some pretty in-depth formulas and creating our own custom widgets in Notion. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you don't miss it. Until then, check out this video on Notion databases to refresh your memory on all the properties within Notion databases. We will definitely be using them in the coming weeks. See you then!